Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight for our event with Dahvana Headley and Annalee Newitz, celebrating their new books, Beowulf and the Future of Another Timeline. My name is Evan Karp. I am the events manager for Booksmith. We're an independent bookstore and a mainstay of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district since 1976. Tonight, as I mentioned, we're here to celebrate Dahvana Headley and the new contemporary verse translation of Beowulf, and in conversation with Annalee Newitz, whose The Future of Another Timeline is just out on paperback. So I want to give like a bare bones summary of the books. The new translation of Beowulf, which is really quite radical, begins with the exhortation bro, which like in some ways maybe tells you everything you need to know. The New Yorker called it electrifying and pointed out that Headley's version of Beowulf is more of a rewriting than a translation, one that has reimagined the poem for the modern reader rather than transmitting it line by line. And Dahvana Headley is a #1 New York Times bestselling author and editor. Her novels include Magonia, Airy, and Queen of Kings, and she's also written a memoir, The Year of Yes. With Kat Howard, she's the author of The End of the Sentence, and with Neil Gaiman, she's co-editor of Unnatural Creatures. Her short stories have been shortlisted for the Shirley Jackson, Nebula, and World Fantasy Awards, and her work has been supported by the MacDowell Colony and by Arte Studio Ginastrea. Please forgive my pronunciation there. Where the first draft of The Mere Wife was written. She's raised with a wolf and a pack of sled dogs in the high desert of rural Idaho and now lives in Brooklyn. And hi, Maria, thank you for joining us and congratulations on your wonderful translation.
Thank you.
A little bit about The Future of Another Timeline. It follows a 17-year-old named Beth who finds herself after a confrontation at a Riot Grrrl concert in a car with her friend's abusive boyfriend dead in the backseat. And that murder leads her and her friends on a path of increasing violence and vengeance as they realize how many other young women also need protecting. It also follows a woman named Tess, who has dedicated her life to visiting key moments in history and fighting for change. Just when Tess believes she's found a way to make an edit to the timeline that actually sticks, she encounters a group of dangerous travelers bent on stopping her at any cost. And Tess and Beth's lives intertwine as war breaks out across the timeline. That war threatens to destroy time travel and leave only a small group of elites with the power to shape the past, present, and future. And Annalee Newitz is an American journalist, editor, and author of fiction and nonfiction. They are the recipient of a Knight Science Journalism Fellowship from MIT and have written for Popular Science, The New Yorker, and The Washington Post. They founded the science fiction website IO9 and served as editor-in-chief from 2008-2015, then became editor-in-chief at Gizmodo and tech culture editor at Ars Technica. Their book Scatter, Adapt, and Remember, How Humans Will Survive a Mass Extinction was nominated for the LA Times Book Prize in Science, and their first novel, Autonomous, won a Lambda Award. Annalee, it's always a treat to be in your presence, and congratulations on The Future of Another Timeline. Thanks for being here tonight. I think that's it for me. Thank you all so much for being here, and I'm really elated to turn it over to Maria and Annalee. Thank you both for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for hosting, Evan, and thanks to Booksmith, which is just one of the greatest indie bookstores in San Francisco, probably in the world, probably in the galaxy. And you should buy everything there, and definitely buy our books there, but also like buy all your holiday presents there, like buy extra books and like use them to like pad your bunker, just everything, all from the Booksmith. So yeah, so thanks for being here, and nice to meet you, Maria. This is our first time actually chatting with our faces as opposed to chatting on internet.
We've been like this close to each other for years and years, but never have we successfully done an event together or had a conversation. This is very delightful.
Yes, it's super great. So I thought we would start by each of us sort of talking a little bit about our new books and how they're kind of connected to a deep and burning urge to change history with storytelling. And I was especially interested, I mean, I was telling Maria before we started that I'm obsessed with Beowulf and I'm obsessed with her translation. And the thing I wanted to ask you specifically about this was, how do you retell a historical story in order to change history? So I guess like what I'm asking is sort of two things, like your obsession about changing history with storytelling, but also specifically why translate this over 1,000-year-old poem and use that as your intervention?
Well, I think this is one of the things we have in common, strangely. I was maybe like a year and a half ago, before my baby was born, so almost 2 years ago, I heard about your book, and it was the one-line blurb. It was like female time travelers and people who are non-binary and trans, and they're warriors, and they travel and they change the timeline, and they're all really full of book knowledge. they like save the story, and I was like, oh, so that's my goal, except that I just never managed to get a time machine that worked. So the time machine that I ended up using is the time machine of the interventionist canon, I guess is my phrase for it. I started thinking about how I could get under the edge of the canonical texts of something that is taught in high school. Like I read Beowulf in high school for the first time, and I encountered it before that in like a monster drawing of Grendel's mother, and I was like, ooh, I want to be Grendel's mother. But getting under the edge of the story that is the old story and entwining yourself with it, so that essentially you're like channeling. Earlier today, I was talking about it as though you're doing a seance with Anonymous. Like the anonymous ghost is coming up in me and speaking through my voice and my body in my timeline, as well as me kind of going back and saying, Beowulf has always been about this. So it's kind of an act of time travel because the text has been being read for, a couple of hundred years in English. And before that, it's about 1,000 years old, plus or minus plus possibly about 300 years-ish.
Yeah.
So it's old. It's but when you intervene on something that old, you become part of the story of the text, and your interpretation of it becomes part of the long story and entwines with the ways that people may or may not have seen it over the years that it's been being read, may have interpreted. I mean, I'm not the first person to think about Beowulf this way, for sure. I mean, it's like a kind of sparkly brooch story. And I thought that the moment I encountered it, and I think you did too, probably. It's like, it's so much about boasting and bragging and like performative masculinity, or things that are categorized often that way. And it's, that's something that we've had throughout history. Like we still have exactly the same stuff. So it's the interesting sort of changing of the future with the canonical text potentially is enhancing or enlarging the possibilities for interpretation of the long past that we've had, and looking at what might be missing from our understanding of it, and the gaps that have been in there, the things that have been erased. It's an attempt to like kind of elucidate some of the absences.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. The idea that that's a kind of time travel. But it is, yeah, because you're speaking the voice of whoever it was that wrote it down. We think maybe, or people think maybe it was an oral, it was like sort of an oral history or an oral story that eventually somebody wrote down. Isn't the story like that somebody was writing down the poem and then literally stopped in mid-sentence, and it was kind of like that Monty Python thing of like, ah! And then
yeah, there are two scribes, and people speculate that it was a transcription as well as an oral performance, and which it really feels like it is, because it stops for like, let's recap because you were drunk, like, and there will be like a whole recap of all of the events up to this point in the poem, and it's boring and weird, but it's like, it's because it's more than one night and everyone is wasted. So
right.
Like, yeah, and yeah, it stops in the middle of a sentence. Two scribes, the poet unknown. We have no idea anything about the poet. So that's also a cool factor, like poet or poets. Like there could easily have been, a whole bunch of people performing this and adding their stuff in.
Yeah, I'm sure there were. I mean, that's the beauty of an oral tradition. In my novel, Future of Another Timeline, the characters who go back in time talk about editing history, and they get into an edit war over history. And that's kind of what you're doing, is you're editing history. You're going in and you're like, actually, no, this poem is about frat boys. I mean, they're not just frat boys. They have lots of other characteristics. But yeah, I mean, it's amazing, and it's incredibly great. I think like for me, when I was setting out to do Future of Another Timeline, it was basically because I also wanted to travel in time, and I wanted to go back and rescue certain people. Like there's certain historical figures that I imagine going back and saving them from the fates that they met. And I wanted to kind of dramatize that experience and give people a character who was able, in some ways able to do that, and in some ways not really able to do that. So I'm not going to give spoilers, but you know, there's definitely some blood that cannot be unshed. So I think that, you know, this idea of time travel as therapy almost is part of what's going on in my book. You know, the character, it's not just therapy for themselves, but it's therapy for history. Like, how do you go back and revisit a trauma, a historical trauma, and try to retell it in a way that integrates it into a bigger narrative and that allows you to take some control over it. Because so much of history controls us even when we don't know it. And that's part of the thing about history too, like what you were saying, like the missing pieces, the anonymous speakers, the things that we don't know that are hovering at the edges of the text. A lot of the time, the injuries that we suffer in the present are from forgotten histories, things that people have done. For example, in my book, a lot of it deals with the 19th century movement to destroy women's rights and to take away women's access to birth control and abortion and a lot of other stuff. And it's a history that's real and it's been completely erased. You know, I think it's very rarely talked about. When people talk about abortion, usually they'll say, oh, the history of abortion starts in the 1960s. And it's like, well, actually, or the 1860s, or, you know, like the 1060s. We've been doing this for a while now. But I think that's part of the urge that I had, that was just to unbury that history and shove people's face in it. Like, I didn't want it to feel good. I wanted it to be like, yeah, you know what history feels like? It feels like having your face jammed really hard into something pointy. But then also there's fun stuff, like there's chases and there's like people getting laid and stuff. So there's a happy part too.
Yeah, I mean, one of the wonderful qualities of your book is that it allows, even through this really traumatic history that's real history entwined with fantastical history that you blended together seamlessly with it, you allow for joyful encounters, you allow for love lasting a long time, you allow for like healing and salvation for a lot of people. No spoilers, but like people get saved. It doesn't make you feel like the pointy edge is always on you, which is to my joy. I mean, I was thinking as I was reading, I've been doing I always do historical research extensively for my work. I write lots of like the missing bits of history stuff. And I was researching Amerigo Vespucci. America is named after him, and it was his voyages, and he may or may not have made parts of them up. It was questionable, but I was reading his accounts of his voyages, which are from like 1507, and he is talking about abortion in villages, sort of on his way to the new world that he hasn't discovered. But he's talking about it then. He's talking about birth control in these documents, and they're from the early 1507. So it's like, and I never knew that. I mean, I'm 43 years old. I'm like, how am I just encountering the fact that this guy may have made all of his voyages up so that he could claim the new world before another guy who'd already claimed it? He was retconning his claiming. How did I just learn this? It's because the history is like covered over, and it's made simple, and it's made convenient, and it's made a more linear narrative than history ever is.
Yeah, and it's history is rewritten for every generation in the same way that, you know, we kind of reinvent the future for every generation. You know, we have retro futures that were like futures we thought would happen in the 1950s, and the future of the internet we thought would happen in the 1990s, and that turned out to be totally wrong. Like the way we imagined the future of the internet in the 1990s is like going to be somebody's whole dissertation at some point. So I want to ask you more about how you thought about reinventing Beowulf, this ancient story. Partly it's about masculinity. Partly it's also about one particular woman, a mother, Grendel's mom, who doesn't have a name. She's just like badass Grendel mom, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
She's just, yeah. Like, I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how you were thinking about that, how you were thinking about talking about masculinity through Beowulf and also femininity and motherhood. Like, what was your agenda?
I had one. I mean, it's funny to me when people review my work and they're upset and they're like, she has an agenda. And I'm like, as does everyone.
Yeah, exactly.
We would not be writing if we didn't have like really a feeling about what we were trying to do.
Yeah.
And many of us are trying to change the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Not everybody, but like that's a real reason to be a writer. It's a way to change the world. So in this poem, in this translation of the poem, I actually ended up doing things I didn't expect to do because I had already adapted it into The Mere Wife, which is about the women of the Beowulf story, and it's from their POV for the most part. And so I thought, somebody raised their hand at a Q&A and said, like, when is your translation coming out? Because I was talking extensively about translations of Beowulf, and I was angry and fussed, and like drama was flying out my ears, and I was like, none of them tell how it should be, and I was quite bombastic. So somebody was like, well, obviously you are going to translate it, and I was like, no, I'm not going to translate it. But then I started to think about it, and I started thinking that no one had done a version of Beowulf that really drew on the feeling of being a person in one of those rooms, listening to the story. Like, in an exciting way, like thinking this is the entertainment. There are lots of translations that were written for a different purpose. They were written to like sort of gild the ivory tower.
Yeah.
They were written to be like, look at this noble history of white people and noble history of the English, which is not true of what the poem is at all. But it got latched onto with the white teeth of the white men. Basically, it was a long-standing property of people who were wanting that reputation of the English language to be something that was pretty narrow and included mostly guys like them talking the way that they spoke, which was a kind of Elizabethan inflected noble voice. Which, if you think about what the poem is about and what a kind of wild, dirty, drunk brawl of a thing it is, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, no shade on them, fine, they did their work. But the work I wanted to do was to put a new spin on how it would feel to listen to something that was meant actually for mass entertainment, for, the nightly wild story that you'd be up and cheering and shaking your fist and spilling your beer. And I wanted to look at how this text analyzes masculinity. It analyzes capacity to be good, capacity to care, capacity to nurture as a powerful man, which is an unusual and interesting aspect of it. And something that we don't talk about in our culture at this point, most of the time. We don't talk about like the king nurtures his subjects, the king mothers his people. We don't talk about it like that. But in this culture, they do talk about it like that. It's like a marital relationship. It's a very intimate familial bond. Your people and yourself. And if you're a bad king, you're hoarding everything and holding it tightly to yourself and being a monster. And if you're a good king, you're giving gifts. So I want to talk about that. And in terms of the women, I really wanted to investigate their humanity, which a lot of translators have not. They just got bored with the women. And so you read the part, there's one speech by a woman in the poem, and it's the wife of one of the kings, and she's kind of moving the king from behind. She's like, this is what you're gonna do. You are, come on. And so she's powerful, but she often gets written as pretty boring, Wealhtheow. And Grendel's mother is usually written as a very bad monster and very ugly. Like, often her translations are ugly thing with claws, or hag wife, or hell bride. And she's a single mother with a sword. and she's in charge of her own place, which I think was so shocking to Victorian male translators that they just couldn't deal with it. And so didn't have a problem, but we're like, well, obviously that's a monster. Like there's no category for that. That's not a person that we've ever imagined. So they were like, this is an obvious, clearly that's what it means. It means monster. So yeah, I just wanted to investigate like all of this sort of little gaps, but also investigate the fun and the fact that the poem is funny and sarcastic and braggy and silly and all kinds of goofy shit happens throughout. And I wanted to make that clear. I wanted to do a translation that would be fun to read for high school kids who are sitting there bored. And hopefully for everybody else too, but I was a high school kid sitting there going, why isn't this story more fun? It has a dragon. It should be so fun. And then
right?
Very formal.
Yeah. I think you're right that part of it is that Beowulf is part of like this nationalist project to say like England and English have this long tradition. And here's where we start it, is right here, not with the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, because that's too depressing and everybody's always failing and talking and whining about the Danish. But folks, if you want to learn about real life England, just read the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which really gets going in like the 500s. And it's basically every year they write down, oh, the Danish came and kicked our asses again and stole our shit. Oh, and until later, and then they finally kicked the asses of the Vikings, and that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, it's like a grim story. It's not a story of like shiny nobility. It's a story of like, oh, there's mold in the grain. Oh.
The mold in the grain, totally.
They all died again.
Something that Beowulf never seemed to worry about, Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about violence, because I wanted to make sure that we talked about that because there's a lot of violence in Beowulf. There's a violent woman. There's violent guys. They're doing it with valor, of course. This is honorable violence. Mm-hmm. And of course, in my novel, there's a lot of violence too. And I was telling you before this, when we were chatting on email, I was saying that I got pushback from people who were sad that one of the main characters in my novel, who's relatively sympathetic, she's kind of a serial killer. Like she murders a lot of guys. She's kind of an assassin. And it made readers uncomfortable, which I totally understand. I wasn't trying to say that like being a serial killer is good or that murdering people is nice. Like it's not, and the character is, racked with guilt over it. I think eventually, I think she is. Your interpretation may vary, and so I guess like, how do I turn this into a question? I feel like in a lot of your work, and actually in a lot of my work, we're dealing with like questions of who gets to be violent, mm-hmm. who gets to, and not just violent in the like actual swordy sense of like, I have a giant sword and I'm jamming it in your ass, but like kind of socially violent or aggressive, like who gets to occupy that position socially of like, I'm storming in here and I'm telling you how you should run your company or whatever I'm doing as a person. So let's talk about that. So like who gets to be violent and how, and should we be trying to reclaim that? Should we say violence sucks? No one should be violent. How do we deal with that?
Well, it's interesting. I was thinking about, as I was reading your book, there is a sort of violence isn't allowed for quite a bit of the book. That's a rule. And it's, and I was thinking, how can this stand? How is it going to work? It can't work. It can't work. It can't work. So I was waiting. I was like, you can't edit without violence. We all know it. We're all writers. It's bloody.
Yeah, you can't change history without some violence. Yeah. Yeah,
but it stands on the what is justified violence and what is allowable. And we were talking earlier about that in the context of both of our work. And I think that I did a lot of thinking about Grendel in the case of this poem, because I was thinking about him as he's like he's a monster. He is described as a monster. And he eats a bunch of guys. he comes in every night for 12 years and like sticks them in a sack and eats them up.
It's really definitive. Yeah.
Like he's not like questions. We know what he's not human. That's just too many people to eat if you're a human. I think you could eat one maybe, but like big sack, 30 guys.
He's hungry. Yeah.
He's hungry. But in the poem, there isn't any, the explanation for why he's so upset is that he, essentially it's loud. They're in the mead hall, they're singing loudly every night, they're partying. It's like, in my version, it's kind of like a frat house has moved in next door to the wilderness preserve where he lives and he's camping, you know, and he's like, and he can't stand it. And it just drives him over an edge. But then they don't retreat. They just stay in the hall. And every night he comes and eats them up. And then every day they clean up the mess. And then every night he comes back and eats them up again. And the question is always, you know, because it's not inherent in the text, in the original text, and it's not inherent really, most translators don't try to get into it, but it's something that people have thought about certainly, and scholars have thought about, like, what has happened here that has made him really so mad? Like, what kind of transgression is it that has been disallowed by the society? He's not allowed to have the feeling of, you're stealing my land, you're stealing my space. But that's really what's happened. Like, a hall has been built on land that is next to him. Maybe it's land that did not belong to the hall builders in that period of time, probably not. And it's his place, like it's his property. So he has a reason, you know, I mean, there's a reason for him to be defending his domain. And we learned about Grendel's mother, like she's been queen for 50 years, which is as long as Hrothgar has been king. So she predates him in the space. So it's like, okay, so is this actually a story in which the monsters are actually defending their property? They're defending their home. And because they can be categorized as monsters, that means that it's disallowed. And so we get the heroes of the poem who are the monster killers. But it's something that in your story, you know, we have a similar dynamic. We have like the people who are being preyed upon by Comstock and his minions, I guess. And in the real history too, are people that would have been often categorized as monstrous societally. They're people who are like women who are single, who teach sex ed workshops, and oh my God, sex ed, it's too dangerous. It's going to obliterate the patriarchy, because at a certain point, then it's not just about how many babies do you own and how many people can you control.
Yes.
You know? And then you stop being able to own women.
Yeah,
so
it sucks.
Yeah, it's sad and a bummer, and you lose your privileges. Like, you lose your privileges, and then you just want to do some killing. But the killing in the history that we know is always justified by, I killed them because they were monsters. Not I killed them because I wanted what they had, and I really didn't want to deal with any resistance. So I just thought killing them would be easier, you know, or taking their rights away would be easier, or categorizing them as non-humans would be easier. And that's the whole of human history. So I don't know, that was a long-winded.
Yeah, no, but so basically, yeah. So the question is really, I guess, how do we use violence in stories to try to fix some of this stuff? Because I think we're both chronicling these injustices where people have been turned into monsters by people who want to fuck with them, basically. And so, and again, like you said, this happens all the time. It happens right now on the internet. You can just go and you know, find out who's being called a monster today, and being encouraged to die and things like that. So how do I guess this is the thing that I struggle with a lot, is like, is it okay to use violence, to perpetrate violence in stories in the service, in a sense, of getting rid of violence? Like, where is it fitting in? Like, I'm asking you because I don't really have an answer. I mean, I have some half-baked thoughts that might not be very ethical.
I have some of the same thoughts that you have, I think, because as I was reading your book, I was like, you know, there are certain things, particularly over the last few years, but in truth, my whole life, I've been like, why is it this way? Okay, there are about 10 people making it this way. that's not that hard to fix,
Yeah.
In terms of power structures. It's a small group of people, and generally always has been a small group of people with others following them and saying, tradition says that we have to oppress you. Everyone is not part of this small group of highly privileged people. But I think, I'm not a no violence allowed kind of person. Sometimes I think violence is just justified. I think there are certain things that, particularly like generational crimes that they're reinvigorated and for example, I'm from Idaho. So like in my childhood, the Aryan Nations was located in Idaho, and everyone, they were up in the woods in the Panhandle, and I was not in the Panhandle. So everyone in Idaho had their feelings about it because the country knew us very well for the fact that we had the Aryan Nations in our Panhandle and that they were comfortable there. And they were very publicly reinvigorating something that should have been demolished, but wasn't demolished. And now we have a much larger invigoration of that culture, of this sort of fascist Nazi mainstreamed culture that started there, didn't start there, has existed all forever. But there was a lot of the people who were involved in that, which got squelched by the Southern Poverty Law Center. They got sued out of Idaho, which was beautiful and one of the most like glorious things to see happen. But the seeds were there and they were planted in the mainstream culture and they went forth and grew. And, sometimes I'm like, sometimes I think it's very similar to your editing a timeline. Just a little removal of a little camp might have helped the removal of Stormfront and of things of that kind, because, and I don't know how to edit those things. Like, I'm not a time traveler. I'm not like, but from there I could see it, I didn't know it would get so mainstream. I didn't know that it would be a thing that would grow into this vast movement. I thought, okay, everyone thinks Idaho is crazy for this, but then the world changed and everybody was like, oh, it's pretty normal to be, to be a Nazi, which is like something that I think 40 years ago we wouldn't have imagined.
No, that's another weird new twist on the future for sure. I think for me, the reason why I was saying like I have unethical feelings about it is because I think part of it is a revenge fantasy. Like in my work, when I have violence, a lot of the time, especially in Future of Another Timeline, it is explicitly like rape revenge. These are characters like the characters who are committing the murders that we see are responding to rape. They're responding to rape culture and threats. And in one case, actually, one of the characters is raped. And that's kind of how it starts. And it is like pure, it's pure fantasy of like doing to other people what has been done to my people, which is not a good way to start a revolution. So like if you're trying to change the future, right? Like that's the struggle I have as a writer, is that I want to have that visceral emotional outpouring, but I don't want people to think, okay, well that means that, like it's okay to just murder a guy for being a shitty guy. But then things get more complicated, as you said, when you start looking at political movements, like say white supremacist movements, or if you're looking at something like, how do you deal with colonialism? A lot of great philosophers said in the 20th century, actually, that's when you start shooting. Like if people are colonizing your land and enslaving your people, or, semi-enslaving your people, whatever, you can't really talk them out of it. Like you can't sue them. You can't call the Southern Poverty Law Center. At that point, that's kind of the moment when violence makes sense. And so I think that's like always my struggle as a writer, is to try to tell stories where characters are grappling with that and they're trying to figure out what the line is. And like, when is it just a revenge killing just for fun, because I always wanted to cut this guy up, or not me personally, my characters, and when does it become a political act that will actually have good consequences, right? So that we eliminate something that's like actually horrific. And it's like a huge struggle. And I think that's the joy of writing this kind of story, but at the same time, the trouble with writing it. Because it's like, you want to have the thought experiment. You want your reader to come with you on that journey of like, okay, when do we get to kill people? But also you don't want to, leave them feeling like killing is awesome.
Yeah, I think in your work, you definitely create a situation where it's not the only option, and it's not the only option for everyone. There are multiple options for all of your characters in terms of what has to be done. And occasionally something has to be done that's a killing, but like sometimes it's not chosen. Sometimes the choice is not to do that. And it's, I think you're great at writing the complexity of the morality behind how do you change the narrative? How do you shift the tradition into something that isn't a tradition of raping and murdering and the complexity of the moral choice of like what happens if you incite something. I mean, I think even just in probably both of our work, I think about this a lot. I mean, it's there wants to be this mythology that like you write speculative fiction and fantastical literature and it's just good. It's a force for good. But then you look at the history of speculative fiction and fantastical literature and there's a whole lot of problems, right? There are people who latch onto it and go, this is my justification for doing something heinous.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm justifying it because I read, and you're just like, and even sometimes it's like, I haven't had anything like that happen, but I've had people develop very questionable relationships and questionable reads of things I've written where I'm like, how did that come? And I've had people like I had with Mirwife, for example, I had somebody write a review in a major publication who she loved the book. She thought it was fantastic. And also she's a huge TERF. And she, I think, was reading it through a lens of feeling that she was a victimized TERF and that she was the marginalized monster categorized person.
Oh, interesting.
Because she's gotten a lot of flack for being a TERF, as she should. Like,
yeah.
I mean, and I think she was seeing herself as the marginalized characters in that book and felt really bonded to them. And I was just like, oh, it's a weird experience. It's like, one does not want that, and nothing in the review said that, but that's what the thing is. And like, that's not what the review said. And still I was just like, because I don't want it to be used as justification for like actually marginalizing massively and doing violence against other people. Like, but things can get really spun.
You can't of course control how people are going to read your stuff. But I mean, you can do some things. Like that's the writer's bag of tricks, is to try to gently kind of, steer people into a particular channel. And, they're sometimes going to overflow the channel and go into their own weird tributary. And, that's just nature. You can't stop it.
It's true. I mean, for the Beowulf, I wrote a long introduction that really details why I'm doing this in hopes of like making sure that I didn't have a flood of like frantic little white nationalists grabbing onto the translation and using it as justification for more bad work,
Yeah. Yeah, that's a whole other conversation for another time about sort of how white nationalism is reclaiming Western history, and how so many brave historians are fighting back and so many awesome
really
medievalists.
People working in the field, like just kicking ass. And unearthing stuff that I didn't know. Beautiful bits of history that were just gaps,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like if we can fill in some of those gaps with our work, we're doing a good job. We're fighting the good fight.
Yeah.
Okay, so should we take some questions? I don't know I think Evan is here lurking.
Wow.
Hi, I'm here. This has been wonderful. You guys are fabulous, and I'm loving this conversation. We do have some questions. Thank you all who are asking. If you have a question now, it's not too late. Feel free to ask at any time. The first question, is from Blake, who is wondering, are there other perhaps ancient examples of rereadings of Beowulf that give insights into what that people wanted to correct or reimagine?
Well, Beowulf has only really been in the public eye for about 200 years. We don't have stuff that's older than that. So for about 200 years, people have been like translating it and figuring out what it meant. And like, so there's not an ancient version. There are some interesting versions. Some of the versions translated for children. And in fact, often women were the ones translating the translations for children. And so they got categorized as not translations, but as like paraphrases or as children's baby books. But it's Beowulf. It's as much a translation as mine is a translation. And some of those are pretty interesting because they took great pains to understand the hierarchy in the poem, and they had a lens on that, which is maybe something that some people didn't have a lens on, some of the other translators. And there also are some more recent beautiful ones. There's one by Megan Purvis, who is a poet, and she broke it all down by like voice by voice. So it's broken into little smaller poems. So she gives Grendel's mother a voice, but it's a translation, but it's a looser poetic translation, and it's fabulous. Yeah, there's some, and then there's some wild, crazy examples that are just examples of people trying poetry in crazy ways. Like William Morris did this wild translation that's like very intensely rhymey and full of archaic words. So you have to have a dictionary beside you. I do when I read it, because it's all archaic and obscure. And he just wanted to like lean into the impossibility of the text, which is a really actually interesting project, although not a very satisfying translation to read.
And then if you're interested in sort of the fantasy nerd history side of things, there's the J.R.R. Tolkien translation. Tolkien was a medievalist, and he also has a really fantastic translation of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which was later. It's written in Middle English as opposed to Old English, and it was also written by a crazy anonymous poet and is full of like weird riddles and crazy shit. So highly recommend if you want to go more into this stuff, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. But those are very traditional translations, to the extent that there is such a thing as a traditional one. But you can see how these influence Tolkien for sure.
You can just get Lord of the Rings right out of the Beowulf. Like,
absolutely. Straight out of Beowulf, man.
Yeah.
I think that's how they promoted it back in when it came out. So, yeah.
Totally.
That's very cool. I'll drop those links for those books in the chat here shortly. Thank you, Blake, for that question, and thanks for those answers, y'all. The next question is coming from Hannah, who is posing this question to you both. If you can remember it, what lines or sections of your books came first? That's a good question, right?
It is.
It actually, yeah, I'm trying to remember. Do you remember which sections you were first translating?
I do, because I did a crazy thing. Like for the Mirrorwife, it's broken into sections. There are 3 sections, and I realized as the copy edits were going in, and we were like in first pass pages or something, like we were far along in the process. And one day I thought, I should put some lines from Beowulf in between each of these sections. And then I thought, I'm translating Beowulf, but I hadn't started. And so I had to translate really fast, like several little chunks of Beowulf out of order at random. And they were one part was the horns. It was describing Heratal, and describing the towers as antler tipped, like with pokey tops, and that it was waiting for burning, but it hadn't happened yet. And those lines are still in the translation. And just talking about like the debt of violence within a society, and of betrayal within a society, and what's coming for you that you don't know is coming for you, because the whole poem is about something's coming for you and you don't know what it is yet, but your sins are going to catch up to you. Like, and for Beowulf, that's true as well. He, in my version, and I think justifiably, he's done some criminal acts by taking on Grendel's mother, kind of against the rules of the society. He's gone in and done a non-honor killing, essentially. And so later he has to pay. A dragon comes for him and is very angry and can't be reasoned with. So, I mean, I think about like the poem has many echoes throughout, and that's where those lines came from. And then I went, but then I had to go out on both sides of those lines, trying to make them work in the translation, which was a devil's own task. It was hard.
So with Future of Another Timeline, I don't remember the first line that I wrote, but definitely when I first started jotting down scenes, one of the first scenes I wrote was when Beth, who's the younger character, is at a concert, and it was like when I first was inventing this band, and I knew that I wanted the lead singer to be named Glorious, because that's such a great name. And I wrote about Glorious. There's actually a scene later in the novel where Glorious is singing and she like puts her foot up on the amp and she's like leaning forward, and like the character Beth talks about feeling the music in her heart like it's punching out of her rib cage. And that was one of the first scenes that I wrote. And then the other scene, other really early scene was when Morishin, the woman from the future, arrives and comes to the meeting of the daughters of Harriet, not the sisters, the daughters, and kind of shows up and is like, hey, I've got this crazy weird weapon thing that you don't understand. I will lay my life down and I will join you in your quest. And they're all like, what? What the fuck? Who are you? You're not supposed to say that. This is not the way time travel is supposed to be, because they're all academic time travelers. And so they think it's quite irregular that she is so forthright about wanting to murder someone and also wanting to change history. So those were Morishin was like, even though she kind of shows up like halfway through the book, she was actually a very early character in my mind. I was kind of writing toward getting to her because she's so fun. You know, she's such a weird person. And so I really liked that. And of course I loved coming up with Grape Ape, and then made a music video with Grape Ape, which is exciting.
I wanted to talk about that for a second, because you invented this punk rock storytelling form that is going alongside your other storytelling form, and it's so good. And the way that it like is a transformative and life-saving storytelling form while also being a violent story form is something that I meant to say this earlier when we were talking about violence, but the violence of music that is like transformative violence, but not actually murderous violence, is that helps people process and arrive at their next stage. And that's what happens in the book. Is so, I thought really visionary. I loved it. And also it reminded me of the 90s in a good way. Yeah.
And I think, I mean, for those of us who kind of grew up either in the 90s with that kind of music or with other kinds of music that are very anthemic or, poundy, as, the scientific term, poundy. Yeah, I mean, that's part of it. Is it's a way of letting that violence out and feeling it without hurting anyone, which is, it's a difficult thing to master, letting it out without hurting anyone. The actual mosh pit instead of just the like sort of metaphoric mosh pit of being a human. Yes, exactly. The actual mosh pit can be very cathartic, I think, like it's consensual. It's like a consensual brawl. Where everyone agrees like that, well, sometimes people do actually get hurt in mosh pits, but the places I went, they always had nice, safe mosh pit rules, don't break any noses, that kind of thing. I mean, that makes me think it's like Arthurian competitions, like, like the sort of jousts, like the mosh joust. It is, though. I mean, that's the thing about like the Beowulf feeling too, right? Like there's a bit of a mosh pit feeling there, It's like, yeah, bro, we're all getting drunk and we're kind of like, there's like a sort of a feeling of theatrical violence to it, And then Grendel comes and with, his legitimate concerns and, has to eat some people. Back and the real teeth. Yeah, I love it's so funny to think about like that idea that like Grendel and Grendel's mom lived on the land and then these other dudes arrived, because of course, if it's in England, there were a bunch of indigenous people there and there were waves and waves of kind of colonial incursion that like led to the England that we know and love today. And so that's another like way, I wonder if that's another possible translation in the future is thinking about that issue. Someone else will come
Someone
up.
will, and I hope someone does, because it's really, it wants to be looked at through that lens.
Yeah, it's so interesting. We have another.
Thank you. Those were wonderful questions and answers rather, and diversions. The link for Grape Ape has been dropped in the chat, so hopefully we haven't lost too many people. We do have a couple more great questions. The next one is coming from Nivair. Pardon me if I mispronounce your name, but the question is for you both, Maria and Annalee. What's a surprising thing that you learned while researching these books?
So many things. So let's see, a surprising thing. So hi, Nivair. And one of the things, I mean, because one of the big bads in my book is Anthony Comstock, who was this 19th century moralist and agitator who actually did, in fact, influence law. He got some legislation passed, which was called the Comstock Laws for many years. And I did not realize before I started this, I knew he was a shitty asshole. I knew that he was obsessed with female sexuality and how to stop it. And that he was instrumental in kind of shutting down abortion and sexual health clinics, but also porn. So I knew all this stuff about him. What I didn't know was how close his rhetoric was to contemporary men's rights activists. And I read one of his famous books, Traps for the Young, where he talks about what we need to do to kind of have a good, pure femininity. And he essentially wants to, bring back a very early crude notion of kind of gender relationships that probably never existed, but like something where women are kind of owned by men. And the other thing I didn't know was that he always boasted about how he, through legal harassment of women who were providing birth control information to other women, that he was boasting about how he drove them to suicide. And it was in fact true. Many of the women who he successfully prosecuted or successfully got other people to prosecute did commit suicide rather than go to jail. And I was just so stunned that what we think of now as kind of like, 8chan type stuff of like, you should kill yourself. Yeah. That rhetoric has its seeds in like this upstanding Victorian gentleman of the 1860s and 70s and 80s and 90s. I mean, he was a going concern for a long time. And so that was something that he just thought was awesome. He just thought it was super cool that he got women to commit suicide, and because they were monsters. And he was totally frank and upfront about it in a way that even now, I don't think people would be. I don't think very many political figures would openly boast about, inducing suicide. They would kind of make pretend, thoughts and prayers type commentary about it. So that really surprised me, learning that, just that it was so contemporary. So what about you, Maria?
Well, it's related. And just what you're saying is making me think about the sort of echoes of this book of Job. Like now I'm the God I'm that version of God, and that's what the sort of MRA rhetoric sounds like. That's also what the Comstock rhetoric sounds like. It's like, I'm God, and you should kill yourself. I'm going to make you really miserable until you do. That's what it is, and I'm in charge. And there's definitely that structure sort of running through. And in the Beowulf poem, it's a pagan story, but then it has Christian poetry, Christian poets adding in and telling the story. So there's like judgment of the pagans throughout. And you think you're with the pagans. You're like, okay, here we are. We're doing the things. We're like drinking our mead. And then periodically the poet will comment. The poet will be like, actually, they didn't know which god they were worshiping. They were looking at the wrong heaven. They didn't even have a clue of the truth of the matter. And so you get this like God mic voice coming in from whomever is the poet or the scribe, even potentially. Scribes probably definitely coming from early Christianity. And it's just an interesting thing trying to process the tendrils of both patriarchy and Christianity through the poem, and the ways that they're being used to sort of declare who's going to get to be happy, and indeed who's going to get to survive. And the heroes don't. they are declared not non-viable. Like Beowulf goes in, fights for some cursed gold. All he wants to do is touch the cursed gold and kind of kiss it at the end. He's like abandoning his people, and he goes down. And the poet is like, kind of ambivalent about this. So it's an interesting, just researching it and trying to trace the insertion points of something that was potentially a much older story, and then the insertion points of, oops, need to mention a Christian God here, was something that for me was an interesting part of the research into just kind of the depiction of patriarchy in the poem, which is also pretty intense. And I started referring to God as like the almighty big boss, and he's like, you have to report, so I had a good time. I had a good time, she says, researching the entire history of patriarchy in order to smash it into my 3,000 lines of poetry. But I did have a good time because, I think with knowing the entire history, at least you can see the weak points in it. You can see the flaws. You can be like, okay, on this part of the timeline, like in your book, here's a place where if you drive a wedge into this understanding of the story, maybe you can change how it's interpreted as you go forward.
Yeah. And in a sense, maybe restoring how the poem would have been received at the time when it was first being told.
Yeah.
I think that's what's interesting too, is like, we don't really know how the Anglo-Saxons felt about this. Like, we can only guess, but we can try to recreate that feeling of like what it was like to be drunk and listening to a badass story. This was like the Guardians of the Galaxy of the 800s, you know what I mean? They were just like, yeah, kill the monster, dude. Play your tapes, play your tunes, man. I don't know. I don't know
that part again where Beowulf tears off the monster's arm. Tell it again.
Yes. Oh my God. Anyway, sorry. I love that he tears off his arm. It's just such a great moments in history.
I was going to say, touching cursed gold is just so compelling, you would think, from reading history. Right? It's like, what's the deal with cursed gold, you guys?
Just don't take dragon's gold. Just why do that?
Do it. Like, you know better. But like, part of the reason we know better is that Tolkien went in and went, I'm going to change our understanding of what happens when you touch a dragon's gold. The whole story is going to be, Yeah.
Thank you, Tolkien. That was one good thing you did.
Thanks, dude. Thanks, bro. Navarre, thank you for that question. We have another one. This one's from David. David says, so I'm a total Beowulf noob, but want to dive into Maria's two novels. Would reading the new translation first inform a later reading of The Meerwife, or vice versa? And would reading Tolkien's first or another older translation help me get the most out of both?
It's only recently that the translation has existed in the same timeline as the novel. It used to be that you had to read the novel first, and you could read, like, if you didn't have Beowulf experience, you could read either someone else's translation or a summary on Wiki, But now I think you could read the translation first and then read the novel, and there are a lot of like in jokes in the novel that you'll get if you read the translation, because they're referring to all different things about the history of Beowulf and the history of the manuscript and where it came from, and like the way that the story was crafted. So I think that Meerwife is more fun if you read Beowulf first. And as far as like reading someone else's translation, a lot of people have been reading the Seamus Heaney translation next to mine, which I think is probably a pretty fun thing to do. It's a good translation. It's 20 years old. It's interesting because when it came out, it was really controversial in many ways, similar to the way that people have screamed about mine when they've screamed. People have screamed lovely things, but also some very upset things. And when Heaney's translation came out, people screamed that it was Irish, and that he was grafting Irishness into the quintessentially English thing. And it was like, okay, but it is Irish. I mean, he did that on purpose. He was like, let me compare this to the culture that I came from. And it has his POV in it. But now 20 years later, a lot of people have forgotten that. And they're like, this is the quintessential Beowulf translation. It's the most accurate. It's the most literal. And it's not. It's a poetic translation. It's like mine. It's like someone coming in and going, ooh, what could this mean? What could this mean over here? But to read them next to each other, or to read his first, I think would actually be really fun. And, you know, there's also an amazing project called the Beowulf by All Project, which is Elaine Treharne at Stanford headed up this project, and it's like 125, I think maybe even more, translators translating little chunks of the lines. And it's a project to like open up translator POV and have so many different kinds of people doing this translation, rather than just like a narrow set of high level scholars with university chair positions. So it's like people who just love Beowulf translating chunks of Beowulf, and it's really pleasurable to read and really interesting to read. It's up on the internet. It's like you can just climb into it and look at whatever chunk you want to look at.
I would just like to add, as somebody who, when I was in grad school at Berkeley, I was almost a medievalist, and I spent a year studying Old English, where we read Beowulf and we read a lot of other stuff, and learned Old English. I have to say, I don't think you need to read another translation. I think Maria's translation is great. It is poetic, just like Seamus Heaney's translation. And I think the thing that's really great about Maria's translation is that it gives you a feeling, because it's translated into contemporary English, you get the feeling of how it would have sounded to people listening to the poem at the time it was written, when of course it would have been written in slang and in their modern English, right? Which now is Old English, and that they didn't even really call English. So I think it's nice. And what I would recommend doing, I mean, definitely read her translation, then read The Mere Wife, but also find Beowulf, like the original Old English Beowulf, online, which is available anywhere. And you can find like really basic, like interlinear translations that are very literal, so you can kind of see the word order and stuff, because the original poem is so fucking weird, because the English is nothing like English now. It's not like reading Chaucer, where you can like recognize a word here and there. Like, it's very, very different. And, you know, it has this specific kind of scheme, like alliterative scheme, like it's a rhyme scheme where there's like part of one line and then a break and then more of the line. It just looks cool. It sounds cool. You should experience it. You should find like a sound file of somebody reading it in Old English and just realize, like, you know, English has changed a lot in the past like 1200 years, like a lot. It's not at all the same language. And it's just super cool that we're just really lucky to have a translation that like brings that to life for us in our modern English. And so yeah, don't bother. I mean, Seamus Heaney, fine, whatever, but what are you gonna do? You spend your whole life reading translations? No.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you for that that amazing answer, and I wanted to thank David for the question. That's actually all the questions we have. So if you would like to ask one another anything else, please feel free to. Although I think you've been generous with this all already. Yeah, I just want to thank you, and then of course let you both close us out if you have any other remarks that you'd like to make.
No, it's just been a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much to Booksmith. Such a pleasure to finally get to chat with you, Maria, like after being your fan. And it's just so nice to talk about, you know, violence and patriarchy on a nice, cozy evening.
It's so nice to, I mean, also, yeah, I've been your fan for a long time. It's so nice to just like to not have to start at the beginning. Like, Evan can attest that when we came on, we were like already having our panel for 20 minutes before.
They had to keep stopping each other. They're like, no, save this for the conversation.
Yeah, but like to think about, and I think we have in common that, you know, we write stuff that's dark, a lot of the stuff we write, but it's also about processing like generations of trauma and making it into something creative and like world changing. So it's really satisfying to talk with you about that and about like, you know, sort of, I don't know, the brightness of storytelling changing the world and the potential, I don't know, brightness of enlightenment and of equality and the pleasure of getting to be part of that process, which I think was, I mean, when I was a little kid, I was like, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go tell stories and I'm going to make up imaginary friends. And that's just, and to get to do that for a living and also to get to feel like I'm part of a long tradition of changing the world through story is like the best feeling. And reading your book is really a story about that. And your work is always a story about that. So it's just such a pleasure to get to be here with you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I definitely think maybe as my final thought, just to pile onto that even a dark story that's, you know, that's full of violence and that reflects a lot of the horror in our world can be hopeful and can change things for the better. Not because it's warning people away from the bad stuff, but because it's reassuring readers that, yeah, life is sometimes full of violence and horror, but we can also still find our way to friendship and love and to positive change. And that just because things are going wrong doesn't cancel out the possibility that we can rebuild and that we can have a revitalization.
Just tagging on to that, like the Comstock saying, you know, these are the women that I've made commit suicide. I mean, what a splendid thing in a life to be able to make a list and not know the names of people that you helped not commit suicide. You know, it's like the balancing list is a longer list if you do this for a living and this is your project. And I know that that's a long list for you. I know that, you know,
hell yeah.
You've been out there saving lives and I appreciate you.
Back at you. Where can people find our work? Where can people find your work, Maria? Can they find you on the internet as well as in bookstores?
Find me all over the internet, but mostly on Twitter. Right now, if you want to, you can go and visit grandjournal.net, where we're doing a live reading of Beowulf from now until Christmas every day, like 10-minute chunks. And it's a bunch of all-star readers. It's like Alan Cumming is reading on Sunday. Ms. Cracker was our first reader, and it's all up there. So it's like,
nice.
Justin Vivian Bond did a reading today. It's really cool. It's hearing a bunch of different voices do this translation. So
badass.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Cool. Awesome. And you can find me on Twitter too. I have a new newsletter called The Hypothesis that's on Substack. No, I'm not one of the Substack bros, but you know, what. That's all I can say, man. Thanks again for having us, and you can see us on the internet.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. Thank you all for tuning in. Take care and be safe and stay well, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. And buy Annalee's books and Maria's books.
Yes. Support bookstores. I can't even tell like which direction I'm holding these because of camera.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Annalee. This is a pleasure.
Thanks, Evan.
My pleasure.
Everybody.
Good night, y'all.
Good night.